All right, good evening. It's getting late. Um, and I think we had to clarify certain points. We just heard about the constitutional obligation to provide fair share housing. But there's also a constitutional obligation of the township to allow citizens to be heard. This is still a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. I think I feel for the planning board because you inherited a situation that you did not create. No one disputes that the citizens were not provided an opportunity to be heard prior to consideration and official action on the settlement on July 30th and August 17th, 2021. Earlier this evening, we heard about losing control over zoning. Citizens have lost control over zoning as to this settlement. I think, one, we had to go back to the methodology of finding the RDP. And that requires you can't ignore the methodology that was set forth in April 2018. There's a formula. You take the acres, put 6 units on it, then you divide it by 0.20, and that's how you get the RDP. That conflicts with the schedule that was part of the settlement. You have higher ratios. We should understand that. But going forward, we heard tonight that this planning board will own this new fair share plan. And I believe we had to clarify certain issues. If there's a conflict between the August 17th, 2021 settlement and the plan that's dated June 2nd that you're considering tonight, what controls? That goes to the issue about the low income housing tax credits and the long-term tax exemptions. Because in the settlement, we say we are going to provide for the first time to a project long-term tax exemptions. And I think we have to clarify that. I think as part of drafting, it might be very helpful if there's an additional schedule attached here as to all the ordinances that are referenced in the agreement, whether they're the ordinances that approve the Upton deal, the Silverman deal, the Annie Says deal, and the Wells Fargo deal, they should be there. Because also there's references at the end of the agreement to something called the Affordable Housing Ordinance. I don't know what that is. I understand about the inclusionary zoning ordinance, but I don't know what the Affordable Housing Ordinance is. I don't know if it has a number. I don't know when it was adopted. I think there needs to be clarifications. And that's on page 38. If you go to page 39, when we were talking about the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, about the redevelopment fee ordinance that was adopted around 11 o'clock at the last meeting in May, I think you need to look at that paragraph and see if that's true. And Graham probably could give a little more insight in there because Maggie asked for a certain type of provision about the increase in the aggregate, that they would be like a carve out. That carve out is not in that paragraph on page 39. And I would just be concerned as the planning board, you own this document. And I would just like it to be accurate because that goes back to like Wells Fargo. Because Wells Fargo deal, remember there was 2 pieces of litigation filed that they went back to the planning board twice. Originally, that what got a suit, and then they came back. I think you should have that procedural history set forth in your agreement, which is not there. The real issue comes back to, we were told in June 2021 that nothing would happen at the DPW site without any prior public comment from the public. That did not occur. Mr. Mariziti and our BA said that. Mr. Chase was on the call. Mr. Cosgrove was on the call. There are a lot of people, we heard that. The public was lied to. And unfortunately, that's the stench that follows this whole night. This has been going on since the Silverman project with rooftop decks. We lived through that. That's why it's very important that we have the overlay zoning. ordinance, because we were talking about densities. Before, earlier this evening, when I think Gaston was talking about heights of buildings. We need to have all this information set forth now. And I really think it's very important that we have a schedule attached to the document saying what are all the ordinances that are required. So when we go to this compliance hearing, we know every piece is in place. Because we're here tonight on June 15th. We were supposed to be in court on June 8th. We weren't ready. We need to make sure we have all the pieces in place. If we need the overlay zoning ordinance in place, let's get it in place before we go to court. Because there's a very simple issue that I brought up at the May 17th meeting. The public has not even been told yet. When is the date that they had to file written objections to the court? When is the date that citizens who want to listen or participate at the final compliance hearing had to notify Mr. Buzak and the court? That notice hasn't even occurred yet. And I'm just saying to you, take time. Make sure there's no inconsistencies, that this agreement is correct. And Graham, we've been talking about for years, since you showed up in around November this year. I think there's nothing wrong to have a schedule here saying these are the dates of all the ordinances that we use to have our compliance. Because I don't believe we're ready to go, because based on what happened tonight. We need our overlay. We need a long-term tax exemption policy and procedure ordinance. Because to get a long-term tax low-income housing tax credits, you need a long-term tax exemption. And in this document, you say they will go for low-income housing tax credits. Let's be consistent between this document and our settlement agreement, because that is a very issue, because it's going to affect the funding of the schools. And that's an issue that I've been standing up and yelling about for at least 2 to 3 years in this town. But I know it's been a long night. I think I know how the trains are going. But if you're going to own this document, make sure there's no problems with it. That when you have defined terms, you know what it means. And I disagree for what our special fair share housing planner said about collecting fees. There is something called the best practice inventory. Inclusionary zoning template ordinance should have been adopted years ago. We should have been collecting monies. Maybe the money's didn't go into our pot, but we heard before the money would have went to the state, and that would have built other affordable housing throughout the state. Who dropped the ball? This whole process has been about who dropped the ball and who keeps on pointing fingers at each other. Tonight we're hearing the planning board point the fingers at the local governing body. The local governing body pointing the fingers at the planning board, or they're pointing at their attorneys.
Thank you, Mr.
It's time for us to be grown-ups, to work together. If we had to do the obligations, and when we talk about the obligations, I thank this agreement, because this agreement concurred with my analysis. When we talk about unmet needs, who's in the unmet needs? Woodmont, which is subject to the environmental approvals, and the DPW site. And it's the DPW site that's incited really this community. And if I was someone living in South Mountain or in Wyoming, I'd be up in arms. When did you learn that there's going to be a 150 unit project in your top part of the town? You found out after the settlement. I feel for you tonight. It's getting late, but you're feeling the anger of a lot of the community. I'm sorry, but you become a lightning rod. But it's time to say, if we're going to approve this agreement, let's make sure it's right. Let's make sure everything is in there, that we have everything that no one knows, and someone when looks at that knows where to go look for the ordinances. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Feld. And I appreciate one of the earlier points you made on if there are ordinances to actually label them and number them as such. I think that might be a helpful addition we can make. If we're referencing specific ordinances that have been adopted, we can reference them by number, some of which I believe, Beth, please correct me if this is wrong, have not yet been developed, drafted, or approved by us, or the TC.
Yeah, that's correct. So there are a couple things that I can respond to. So one, yes, the inclusionary zoning ordinances have not been introduced or shared with the planning board yet, so they just simply can't, I can't include them, obviously. I will say that ordinances that are for implementation of this housing element fair share plan will certainly be part of the court's record and will be part of the court's review, just for Mr. Feld's information, for anybody else that's curious about that process. There was a question about what is the affordable housing ordinance and had that been adopted yet? Yes, it has been adopted. It's ordinance 2596-22. And that is an ordinance that simply regulates affordable housing units that are created regardless of where they're created, what program, what developer, et cetera. It has no relevance to site-specific zoning. It's just simply, if you're building affordable housing units in town, these are the standards that you must meet. So for example, it would talk about setting rents properly, marketing the units, number of bedrooms per unit, things like all of the various requirements for affordable housing units. I just need to push back on the assertion that that I'm incorrect about the development fees. The municipality, like every municipality, was required to collect the 2.5% non-residential development fee when the state adopted that amendment to the Fair Housing Act. I have no reason to believe Millburn did not do that and then of course send those fees to the state, but we are not able to retain those or collect residential development fees until we start this process. And as I said before, have our development fee ordinance approved and either adopt a plan to spend those fees or commit to doing so in the future. And then the last thing I wanted to know is everything that is before the planning board today, this evening, is part of the housing element of the master plan. A lot of these other documents that are being referenced, like the ordinances, yes, they're relevant to the housing plan because it's part of its implementation, but that's not actually part of the master plan element itself.
It's a question of transparency. If when you look at a document, when we hear inclusionary zoning, or you talk to the other one, the average person will not know where to look at. And I think just having a schedule will make it easier for someone who's maybe not today, it might be 2 years from now, has to track something down that they're not going on a snipe hunt. I'm just trying to make something easier. I made that in a suggestion in good faith, because a lot of the things that we're talking about is bad faith, in my feeling, bad faith. Because if you made your plan in April of 2018.
Thank you, Mr. Feld. Yeah, I think
we could have taken steps in doing things. We could have taken the survey about how many apartment buildings are deemed to be blighted or need to be rehabilitation. We don't even know if that has even occurred yet. And then you did that in the settlement.
Mr. Feld, just in the interest of time, we did allow you to make a testimony and ask questions. We still have a few people who have their hand raised.
I let the other people, I'm gonna go off. Thank you.
Thank you.